reference. But twice this week, I've shared the International Riesling Foundation's scale for sweetness. Has anybody seen that on the back of a bottle of Riesling before? It's a neat little visual scale. So look up International Riesling Foundation. If I had the link on me, I would have pasted it in the chat just a second ago. But if you look it up, they provide the format for a visual scale that can be put on the back of a bottle of Riesling. Not all places do it, but I've seen it quite a bit in the Finger Lakes. I think I've seen some producers out of Quebec do it as well. And then they also have some quantitative information that backs that up. So they kind of break the scale into a bunch of sections and then give you an idea of, yep, exactly, the relationship between the sugar and the acid at the various levels. I gave this link out to 2 people this week that had responded to me about some feedback I had provided on competition entries about the acid balance. And I said, the best thing I can tell you is that if you look at this and get a feel for the fact that there's a relationship between these two things, and these objective measurements, when paired up with what your senses tell you, should give you an understanding of where are the pleasant points on this spectrum. Because each of these points on the spectrum is designed to have a balance of sugar and acid that creates a pleasant result. You know, one of them is dry, one of them is sweet. There are several in between. And they're not arbitrary in the sense that there's a range of acid and sugar at each of those levels that it needs to be in so that people perceive it on that spectrum as somewhat pleasant. So I think that's where you have to take the science and say, I have to have that, but now I actually have to, you know, I've got some skin in the game here, which is my senses have to be able to help me figure out what to make sense of here. You can't do it by the numbers.
Absolutely. I know people that are very much into the numbers, like what we're looking here at the Riesling Foundation for reds and whites. Just in general, most wine makers, they can kind of know, they know that most reds, most people have said that when they're tested, they like them. And in other words, they know some parameters for their pH, both in reds and whites, and their TA that kind of fit the bill for like maybe 80 or 90% of those of us out in America that drink wine. But if you try to build your mead and it'll match those parameters, that doesn't mean anything at all, because it's totally different when you've got all the different fractions at work all in conjunction or concert with each other. And I knew some guys that I was real excited about getting some of their meads because I knew that they knew a boatload about making wine, way more than I even care to know. And they had all this testing equipment, and this was before I bought all of my analyzers and whatnot. And I was excited to get their stuff, and when I finally got some and tasted it, I was extremely disappointed because I knew that they had built their stuff by the numbers, but it in my estimation, was not very good meat at all, really.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the numbers have as much of a chance of taking you in the wrong direction as being close-minded with what your senses tell you as well.
Absolutely.
Really, at the end of the day, this is about enjoying it. And so it's somewhat subjective. But if you're going to share it with other people, it becomes a lot less subjective when you remember that people don't necessarily perceive all of that stuff the same way as you. If you implore them to spend a moment thinking about a glass of something that you hand them, more than just, ooh, this is awesome, think about it. Is it too sweet for you? Is it not sweet enough? Does the acid taste right? Like, if you can entertain that conversation with somebody, you have to be inherently open to the idea that they're going to come back and say, well, you know what? Like, it'd be nice if it had just a little bit more acid, like if it popped just a little bit more. And then you realize, that's interesting, because I think it's perfect just the way it is. And you have to decide, is my palate telling me it's perfect, or perhaps have I convinced myself that I couldn't necessarily see doing anything else with it because I didn't necessarily think it was going to be better, but that person just led me to the point where if I had, they would have thought it was just that hint better, and I might have as well. And that's where you have to be willing to kind of play around with it a little bit, you know, and then you can say, okay, I have these ranges. When the amount of sugar is X, I like my acidity to generally be in this range. That acidity is contribution of a whole bunch of other things, and that's where it gets challenging because you have a whole bunch of different types of acid. You've got malic and citric and tartaric, you know, depending on what types of things you fermented with. You know, if you're doing any types of wild fermentations, you know, you might have lactic acid and acetic acid. You know, honey has gluconic acid in it, is its primary acid. So you got all of these different things. So the pH number again is an aggregate of the amount of acidity that all those acids are contributing to it. So one mead next to another made with two different sets of ingredients, honeys and fruits, it may not be as pleasant. The numbers are not they're going to lie to you. It's going to be great on one side and horrible on the other. And that's where you have to start understanding what's different about these ingredients. Is there apples have a lot of malic acid in them, where a fruit like strawberries doesn't have that contribution of malic acid. Does malic acid taste more or less strong to you? And at the same level of pH, do you feel like you still need to intervene with the sugar with one or the other in order to balance how that acid actually presents itself to you? So it ends up being a very complicated scenario. I'm sure I've just depressed a lot of people on the listening to this, going, oh, he's going to give me the keys to creating balance in this, and oh, he just filled my head with all kinds of things I didn't want to know.
Nope, the key is right in your own face. It's called your tongue.
It is. I mean, it really is amazing. We're crowdfunding for the launch of our tap room now, and my wife did a video last week, and she took a segment of me where I was measuring some meads, and so I'm sitting in front of the refractometer and the pH meter, and of course, I mention what they are and what I'm trying to do, but I also hold out, that the most important tool in the winemakers or the mead makers toolbox is their own senses. Those numbers could be completely irrelevant. If it tastes horrible to you, the numbers don't mean anything, because they're not right, because it's not pleasant. A different set of numbers might be right, but they might make a whole lot less sense to you, because numerically you might look and go, I don't know anybody that would think that pH and that sugar level should go together, but boy, this is really pleasant. So now you've got another example of a range where those two numbers are calibrated to each other, that for that particular mead and the ingredients that were in it and how it was produced made sense. Tomorrow you'll make another mead, and those two numbers will not make sense at all.
And I think that's the hard part for beginners to understand, is they want, and rightfully so, we all learn to make stuff by using a recipe, but mead is something I could give you my exact recipe, and as you know, Jason, you're not going to make what I make, even though, you're a better mead maker than I am. It's just different, and it's science married with craft, or what's the other word I'm looking for?
Art is what I typically say.
Yeah. So you've got to be a scientist, and then you have to be a chef at the same time.
Yep.
And you can't teach the chef part. You've got to learn that, you guys, by doing it, by making tests.
And I think that's what you just said.
Making mistakes.
Yeah, you have to be willing to make those mistakes, and I think this is where Ryan, you and I know from some of the groups that we travel in, is that we get these questions about, I need a foolproof recipe for this or that, and it's like I cringe when I see it, because I can't really respond the way they want me to respond.
Right.
don't want to respond the way I really want to, because of course I don't want to be a jerk. But so it's that response in the middle where you say, okay, all right, that's like, this person's just getting started. How can I help them do a good enough job that they'll be happy with the result that they get? They'll be informed enough to understand that if they didn't get the result that they really wanted, but of course it didn't go horribly, horribly wrong, that they'll come back. And then what they're going to do is what you and I could do. So say we did swap a recipe, Ryan, and we each made, the other's recipe and then shared it with the other. Knowing that we would likely get different results, we'd have a conversation about it, though. And you can imagine the details that we would share and the questions that we would ask each other. And I'm willing to bet you that we'd be able to hone in on a couple of things that we each could do in a repeated experiment that would bring those two meads so close together that other people wouldn't necessarily be able to tell they were made by two different people. And
I agree.
That's where we're trying to get people to, is to understand that it's a journey. And part of that journey is sometimes you have to stop and you got to say, hey, I got to take a break right here. I got to go inside and talk to this guy because I know he's going to understand where I'm at with this. And hopefully we're going to be able to sit there for a while and churn over this and come up with some ideas of what we can do to get closer to whatever that ideal result is. And that, I think, scares people, because they immediately realize how little confidence that creates for them, because they realize just how kind of murky and unsure some of this stuff can be. And I really hate giving people that as an answer and sending them away thinking, boy, these guys are real jerks. They don't really want to tell us how to do this stuff. They've gotten to the point they've got it all figured out and they don't want to tell everybody. But what they don't realize is we don't have anything figured out. The only thing we have figured out is that we know how to approach the problem.
Yeah.
And that we've got resources, and we'll go use those resources, and we have friends, and we'll ask questions, and we'll be willing to say, you know what, that was not the right addition to make to that, but I know how to fix it. I know how to do something to make it better. So,
what I always want to tell newbies is, here's a recipe, but what you really want to know, and you don't even know this yet, is you really need to learn the science, and then go learn to make good traditionals. And once you can do that, you've upped your game and everything else you could ever make, more than spending the next 15 years making a bunch of stuff that you don't even know what's going on, and hit and miss on a good recipe every once in a while.
Yep. I mean, and we see people starting out in such interesting ways. They're shooting at a commercial example. They've had somebody shared and
I want to make Heart of Darkness, right?
yeah. I wasn't necessarily sure where I was going to go, but that is a perfect example. And you just look at that going, how do I advise this person? How do I talk them off the ledge here? And it's awesome to have that as a goal, but if you persist at trying to do this, more likely than not, especially if you've never fermented anything before, you are going to be so wildly disappointed in that result. It would be better for you to have a much lowered expectation so you were happy with what you had when you got done with it, as a foundation to say, okay, I want to take this to the next level. So which production technique that these guys are talking about all the time that I don't yet understand do I want to introduce in here? Or maybe I should ask, here's what I did, guys. If I want to take it to the next level, where do you think, if there was one area and I was going to do a next experiment with it, where do you think I should focus? I love those questions. Those questions are great. Right. Because you realize
that there's an answer. There's an answer to those questions.
Yep. And the person gets it. They get it. They get that there's a bunch of variables in play, and they're going to try to go understand one and add it to their regimen, and then they're going to come back looking for another one. Unfortunately, you're talking about a fairly lengthy journey. Someone's like, well, so that means it's going to take me a year to kind of tweak my process to the point that I might be really happy with what I'm making. Well,
only a year?
Patience, how long will that take?
Right. After almost 15 years of doing it, the sad answer is yeah, I'm still on that journey.
Yeah. I've been making mead for 25 years, and I learn something new every single day. You know, I mean, I read and I study and and I'm constantly finding things that are like, oh, well, I never thought of that. You know.
Yeah, that said, I've had a couple of cases where, you know, I've had an archaic old recipe that I created when I didn't know any better, and I tried updating it, and honestly, I didn't like the results, so I've gone back to